All right, so I've got a graph here that's going to graph a parabola, and this parabola is the normal parabola. In other words, it's the parent function y equals 1 x squared plus no x's plus nothing. So this is the simplest possible parabola. And I'm going to ask a few questions about what happens to that parabola when I change these parameters. What happens when I change this thing? What happens when I change this thing over here? So this would be ax squared plus bx plus c. What happens if I change a, the number in front of the square? What happens if I change c, the number over here that's by itself? So as I'm going through this video, there's a couple of things that we need to notice. So I'm going to actually go ahead and change these to c's. I guess they should be c's. Okay, so what is going to happen if a, the number in front of the square, is 2? What's going to happen if it's 0.5? What happens if a is negative, and what happens if c, the other parameter, is negative? So I'm going to play around with this number a. I'm going to play around with this number a that's in front of the x squared, this number here a, and I'm going to see what it does. Okay, so this time I want you just to watch the equation down here. So please just look at what I'm doing with the equation down here. I'm going to push this up arrow up until I get to 2, okay? And then I'm going to go back down again, and I'm going to start dividing that down to 0.5. Okay, so this time I'm going to start with the parent function again. This time I want you to watch the line. And just like before, I'm going to go up to 2 times 2, and then I'm going to go back down to times 0.5. All right, so this is where I'm starting. This is the quote-unquote normal parabola, just 1x squared plus 0. So I'm going to move the a up to 2. As you can see, the parabola, which was around this area right here, went up to 2. And now I'm going to go back down. So I'm going to start dividing instead of multiplying, back down to 1 again, and then I'm going to keep dividing down to 0.5. And you can notice that dividing is going to make the parabola wider. If I continue dividing, the parabola continues to get wider. If I multiply back up, okay, then I'm back to my regular parabola, my standard parabola, and I can make it narrower by multiplying. As a gets bigger and bigger, as I multiply by bigger numbers, the parabola gets narrower and narrower. All right, so back down to 1 again. Okay, so now I can answer a couple of my questions here. What happens if a is times 2? What happens is that the parabola is narrower. Okay, so the parabola goes from a normal parabola, and if I multiply by 2, it becomes narrower. So that would be 2x squared. And now what's going to happen if a is 0.5? What happens if I'm dividing by 2, 1 over 2? What happens if I'm dividing by 2 instead of multiplying by 2? Well, that's going to make the parabola wider. All right, so that would be 0.5x squared. Okay, so a is the coefficient, the number in front, and it makes the parabola wider and more narrow. So wider for dividing, and when I'm multiplying times 2 times 3, that becomes narrower. Okay, what would happen if a was negative? What would happen if a was negative? All right, so here I am with my parabola again. This is my coefficient a. I know that I can move it up to 2 so that I'm now multiplying by bigger and bigger numbers to make it narrower, or I can divide it by bigger and bigger numbers and it's going to get wider. But what happens if I keep going all the way to 0, so no slope? Now a is going to become negative. So I'm going to now start multiplying by bigger negative numbers. Okay, and then I'm going to start dividing by negative numbers. So here I am at negative 0.5. What happens if a is negative? This is a frowny face. This is a negative, unhappy face. Whereas the other parabola, when it's positive, is a happy face. That's going up. It's trending up. Okay, what happens if a is negative? Okay, if a is negative, then I get a frowny parabola. I get a parabola that trends down to the negative infinities. And if a was positive, I get a happy parabola that trends upwards, up to positive infinity. So I've got a negative parabola here and a positive parabola here. And when I say negative and positive, I mean the coefficient a that's in front of the square. I mean this number right here that's in front of the square. Whether that's negative or positive determines if it's a happy or a frowny face. If it's trending up, like this one, positive, or trending down, trending down like this one. That's a negative coefficient. All right, so we've got one last question to ask. I'm going to put this back to 1. What about this number over here, the number that's over by itself? Well, I've talked to you before about this is the y-intercept c, and so if I'm changing c and not a, what happens if c is negative? If c is negative, the last thing we need to notice, I can make c positive, and I'm going to move the parabola up. In other words, the y-intercept is increasing until it hits right here. The y-intercept is increasing until the parabola is now at 6. Nothing else about the parabola has changed. I'm simply moving the parabola up. And now I'm going to move the parabola back down again. Back to 0. And now let's make the c negative, the y-intercept negative. Okay? So what happens if c was negative? The parabola was moved down. The whole parabola was moved down. Okay, so we've got two different coefficients, or two different parameters. The first of the two parameters, I'm going to move this back up again. If I am multiplying the parabola, that's this number here. And when I multiply the parabola, it can either make it multiplying means narrower, or dividing means wider. Here I am dividing by 2. Here I am dividing by something close to 3. The more I divide by, the wider it gets. If a becomes negative, then all of a sudden it starts going down again. So I can now multiply by, say, -3. -3 is going to be a narrow, negative parabola. All right, and the other coefficient that I can, or parameter I can change is this one. I can move the parabola up. I can move the parabola down. All right, I'm going to summarize that a different way. I have here my original parabola. This is the parabola. The equation is down here. 1 times x to the second power plus 0x plus 0. This is my standard parabola. And I can do a couple of things to that standard parabola. I can, from here to here, well, what happened? From here to here, it transformed by becoming narrower. So this is a narrower parabola because it is times 2. 2 times x squared is negative and positive. Is narrow because it's times 2 and positive because the number is positive, the coefficient is positive. Now here I've got 0.5 or 1/2 x squared. Now that's going to be a wide because the number that I'm multiplying by is between 0 and 1. It's less than 1. So it's positive, but the parameter is less than 1, and so it is wider. Okay, so the other thing that I can do, instead of changing this one to make it either wider because I divide or narrower because I multiply, I can also make the parabola negative by changing the a from a positive parabola to a negative parabola here. So positive parabolas are going up, they're increasing, they're rising, and negative parabolas are unhappy, they trend downwards. The last thing that I can do is change not the first number but the second number here. 0. Here I start at 0, and then in this case I've moved it up. I've moved this parabola up. And the way to do that is by adding to the parabola plus 4, and here I've moved the parabola down. Moved it down, and here the parabola has been moved -4.